All right, I think now we're live here on YouTube, and welcome everyone to another Salem Center event. Today we have the pleasure to have with us John Cochrane from the Hoover Institution, and he's joining us to talk about inflation, causes and cures. John has been with us a couple of times before, from COVID to inflation, and anyway, so looking forward to your talk. And given the size of the audience, John said he's willing to take questions along the way as we go along here. So if you have a question, raise your hand in the Zoom chat, and I'll call upon you, and I'll give you permission to speak here, so we can keep this discussion based. Anyway, John, thanks for joining us. Take it away.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm sorry I'm not here in person, but such is life. Hope next time we can do it in person. So it's a lot of, I really enjoy the Salem Center and all the great things you do. So I'm happy to do a little joint advertising there. This is, so the title, Fiscal Histories, is the title of an essay I just wrote. It's for the Journal of Economic Perspectives. I encourage you to go find, it's on my website, johnhcochrane.com, if you want to read it. God forbid you want to read something. It has no equations, so that's part of the part of the idea. Can we explain the basic idea with no equations? But it is about a larger project. I put the in my little cover slide here. You'll see the book cover of the upcoming book, The Fiscal Theory of the Price Level. And that's my big project. This is in part a book talk. That's coming from the Princeton University Press in January, but I'll give you a little secret. You can get it for free. Just go to my website, and I have a practice of putting the manuscript of all my stuff up on the website until the publisher calls and says, John, you got to take that down now. And so until Princeton calls, you can get it for free. Nothing, we're free marketers, so nothing like, there's no free lunch. There still is a free book, at least until January. Together with the fiscal histories and some other essays that you might be interested in. I have to admit, I do feel like one of the luckiest economists in the world. I turned in a book draft about a year and a half ago. The book draft was, I turned it in right about there on the graph. And it said, well, there's a book about inflation. I've been working on this for 20 years. Inflation and fiscal policy. No one cares about inflation anymore, but maybe someday you will. I did get to revise that introduction, but just in time for inflation to take off. And inflation about fiscal policy. And that's what the graph here graphs the history of inflation and interest rates. The red is inflation, big waves of the 70s, long quiet period, and here you see it exploding now, together with the interest rate, which is the main thing we think about with the Fed doing inflation. So what I want to do today is, I'm not going to try to do a 550-page or whatever it is book full of equations for you. Instead, I want to talk about some of what the Fiscal Theories Histories essay is about, which is, let's try to use this framework and understand what in the heck's going on. Why do we have this burst of inflation now? Is the Fed, you can see in this little graph, I'll show you big graphs in the middle. See, even in the 1970s, the Fed responded fairly quickly to inflation. We got inflation anyway. Right now, the Fed took a whole year of sleeping before it did anything. And now interest rates are still well below inflation. We haven't seen the red line above the blue line like ever this much. So is that a 3-alarm fire signal of things to come or not? So I want to talk about, with this framework in mind, I want to talk about, where are we going with inflation, together with, of course, how do you interpret the historical record? Theory about things going forward should have something to say about the historical record here, at least be consistent with that record. And that's what Fiscal Histories is about. It's not proof, but it's about existence. Is there a consistent story with this fiscal theory hat on to think about interest rates and inflation? And really, I'll advertise, this is, we're really shy on economic theories. Where does inflation come from? There's the old MV equals PY monetary theory, but the Fed doesn't control the money supply. Sorry, that's a nice theory. The Fed does not control the money supply. Done. Then, how does inflation actually get determined under interest rate targets? That has been, at least in my view, until this beautifully covered book came out, somewhat of a mystery. So I hope to, complete. This is a fairly audacious project. What is understanding, our theory of inflation when the Fed sets interest rate targets. Okay, let's go. Like any theory, we got to spend just one slide on what is the conceptual framework, and then we'll just get to work using it, because the whole point of this book is that we don't. A theory is only important if it's useful. So let's make it useful, and that's the point of today. Let's try to understand where does inflation come from today, and if we can come to a nice understanding, then it's a good theory, not a useful one. I found the chat. I love this. This is. It makes me feel right at home. At the University of Chicago, you never get off your title slide before people start asking questions. So I'm delighted to make me feel right back at home. Interest rate be contrasted. Yes, that's exactly right. The question is, shouldn't interest rates be contrasted with prospective rather than retrospective inflation? 100% yes. And that is, in fact, a key ingredient of what I'll show you, is to think about interest rates. I use rational expectations. You don't have to be quite that doctrinaire, but just about forward-looking. And that difference of thinking about interest rates relative to forward-looking inflation accounts for pretty much all of the interesting and different things you'll see today. So let me give you just a little bit of theory. What is the fiscal theory of the price level? Fundamentally, where does inflation come from? Why do we work so hard for these dollar bills? And why can we use pieces of paper to buy valuable things? Well, here's the theory. Debt, so total government nominal debt, about the $30 trillion of stuff that's outstanding, divided by the price level makes it the real value of government debt, equals the expected present value of primary fiscal surpluses, the amount of taxes greater than spending that the government will run. This is asset. I used to spend my life as an asset pricing finance person, and this is just the theory of asset pricing applied to government. Price per share times number of shares is expected present value of dividends for stocks. Bond price is the expected value of the coupons that you will pay. So we're simply making the exact same statement for the government, that the value of government debt is the value. How are you going to get paid back if you hold government debt? Well, the government sooner or later, after we've tried everything else, has got to run some primary fiscal surpluses in order to pay back that debt. So the value of the debt is the value of the surpluses that will eventually, someday, pay it back. Properly discounted, which is very important. And that's not, this is not fancy schmancy theory. This is quite intuitive. Suppose we're sitting around holding government debt, and we investors and people collectively come to a realization, you know what, these guys aren't good for it. There's no way that they're going to be able to raise enough taxes relative to spending or do it to pay back the 30 trillion of debt. Maybe they're only good for 20 trillion, not 30 trillion. Well, what do you do about that insight? That means that sooner or later, this debt will either be inflated away in the future. They'll have to just print money to pay it back, or they'll have to explicitly default on it. If you see that coming, what you do is you try to get rid of the government debt today. It's a terrible investment. What do you do with an overpriced stock? If you're holding a stock and you see the CEO disappearing into a limo with plane tickets to Rio and suitcases full of money, you try to sell it, right? But if we all try to sell government debt, someone's got to hold it. So in the end, all we can do with the government debt is try to buy stuff with it. And as we buy stuff, we drive up the price of goods and services. So the fiscal theory of economy it feels exactly normal. It feels exactly like, in fact, our economy feels. Inflation comes from people trying to spend more than is available by too much aggregate demand. But the only way for us to buy more of everything is to buy less of government debt. Basically, what is there in the economy? There's everything and there's government debt. So in order to buy more of everything and drive up the price level, you got to try to buy less government debt. So that's all we're saying. So a couple hundred pages later, how does this theory tell? What does this theory tell us about how the world operates? And I've put up here two what I think are very useful conceptual experiments. So we'll keep these in mind and try to read history as to some extent these two effects. So what I'm showing you in the top graph, there is a model behind this, and the model includes sticky prices. Why? Because prices are sticky. There's some dynamics. If we all go out and start to buy things, inflation takes a while to get going, and once it gets going, it takes a while to go away, as you're seeing outside. So the core extra assumption in what I put down there is sticky prices. The other core extra assumption, not assumption, the core modeling thing that isn't obvious from the top equation is what's the interest rate doing here? The Federal Reserve remains powerful in a fiscal theory of the price level. I call it the fiscal theory of monetary policy. Implicitly, by setting the interest rate, there's two levers here. The government can set the debt and it can set the surpluses, and the price level comes out. So implicitly, when you work it out, the Fed can operate by setting the interest rate on government debt, and that has an important effect on inflation. What's the effect on inflation? Let's look at what it looks like. So here are the two conceptual experiments. First conceptual experiment: what if we have a deficit, a big deficit, that people do not expect to be repaid in the future? Or what if the government prints a bunch of money and drops it by helicopters? That is a fiscal deficit. It's a fiscal transfer in the way we run things. And crucially, that people don't expect will be repaid. So what happens? Well, there's more of this stuff debt. There's no change in the stuff on the right side, fiscal present value of primary surpluses. So what's got to happen is you get inflation. Price level's got to go up. But with sticky prices, the price level goes up slowly, and it takes some time. So here is the effect of a deficit that people don't expect to be repaid, and interest rate stays constant. Why? Well, let's try to separate fiscal and monetary policy. So suppose the Fed does nothing about it. What happens? And then the next one is what if the Fed does something, but you get to add the two to understand history. So suppose there's a fiscal shock, drop money from helicopters, drop government debt from helicopters, and the Fed does nothing about it. What do you see? Boom, you see inflation. People try to get rid of that debt, but since prices are sticky, it takes a while. So no surprise. This is the effect of a 1% of GDP deficit that won't be repaid. You can see you get 40%, but I picked the numbers to make a pretty graph. This is not a calibrated model. You get not just, you might have thought from looking at this, you get an instant jump in the price level, but no, with sticky prices, you get years of inflation. So you can tell what the next slide is going to be. Hey, that looks a lot like now, doesn't it? You also get, sort of for your conceptual thing, this long period of inflation. Look what's happening here. Inflation is higher than the interest rate for years and years. So bondholders are going to lose money. Basically, if the government spends money and it's never going to raise it in taxes, it's got to come out of the pockets of bondholders. So how do bondholders lose money? Bondholders lose money by this year after year of inflation being higher than interest rates. So many years of negative real returns. That's where we've been since January 2021. Bondholders, we've inflated away something like 15% of the debt already. We have interest rates that are still very low, inflation that's quite high. Year after year, the bondholders are losing money. So you see big debt and no surpluses, or if you'd like, a decline in surpluses and no change in debt, that causes inflation. But the mechanism is many years of slowly losing wealth in bonds by interest rates being below inflation. Second possibility, what if the Fed were to raise monetary policy? Now here in the second graph, no change in fiscal policy, right? So first a change in fiscal without a change in monetary policy. John, I'll get to you in a second. Second one, a change in monetary policy, but no change in fiscal policy. So what is the pure effect of raising an interest rate, but but no change in surpluses and deficits? Well, this one's very interesting. First, you get a temporary negative inflation. That took some doing. It requires long-term debt to get the thing, but it is true, even in fiscal theory, that people's standard belief raising interest rates can lower inflation in the short run. But notice that the inflation comes back again in the long run. There's an unpleasant arithmetic here that by creating higher inflation in the long run is how the Fed can create some inflation in the short run. So the Fed's main ability is to move inflation around, but it can do some good. So this is the effect of a fiscal shock. That's effect of a monetary shock. Okay, we have a bunch. We've got chats. We got questions. Whose question? Chat.
Let me let John
help me out, Carlos.
Hatfield. Go ahead, Hatfield.
Yeah. So, John, I had a question. You said that the bondholders lose money over time. Shouldn't the bondholders lose all of their money right at the beginning? When the helicopter drop happens, we all realize there's going to be this inflation in the future. And so the bondholders just take a huge hit in the price of their bonds immediately?
That would be the case if prices were flexible. And that is, in fact, exactly what happens in the flexible price model, because then real interest rates are constant. And so bondholders, short-term bondholders can say, no, we're not taking, we're going to demand the same real return right away. But with sticky prices, there can, monetary policy has real effects, can lower the real interest rate. So in fact, there's this period of low real interest rates, and that's the best bondholders can do. I can see by silence you're not agreeing with me. I'm
just not sure that what you mean by the best bondholders can do. The bondholders presumably know all of this is going. Are you saying that the bond prices themselves are sticky?
No, only goods prices are sticky.
Right. So it should be when you say the bondholders lose money over time, you mean because there's inflation, but it should be that in some sense, all of the loss is taken by the guys who are holding the bonds when the helicopter drop happens, because they're the guys who are surprised. Every other future bondholder, if I buy bonds after the helicopter drop, I buy them at a discount now because everyone knows that all this inflation is coming down the pipe.
What has happened is the real interest rate is lower. With sticky prices, money and real money is non-neutral. So you wake up, whether you're a bondholder or not, you wake up in a world where suddenly the real interest rate is low, is negative here. And so you're going to lose money on nominal bonds. And if you sell them or hold them, it's in the rollover, you're going to lose money.
Okay.
It's not just this is really important for realistic, right? If all we could get was one period, boom, price level jumps. We don't see that. We see drawn out inflation. But in fact, you can have a period of negative real interest rates, and that's how bondholders lose, even if they're rolling over short-term bonds.
Right. But even in your theory, all those negative real interest rates are priced into the bond.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Bond markets are totally efficient here. It's just the price. The only sticky prices are in the.
Okay. So they've correctly forecasted.
Yep. Now, this is a weird graph. And notice that the inflation always goes to where the interest rates go. In fact, it's kind of weird now. Many people right now think with inflation higher than interest rates, inflation must spiral away and get worse and worse. Not in this simulation. The Fed, which seems to think inflation will go away so long as there's no fiscal shocks, is right. Inflation sort of goes away. Here, too, when the Fed raises interest rates, the thing that people talk about, the lower inflation is true. But in the long run, the inflation goes up and meets the interest rate. That seems really weird, doesn't it? But it's an inescapable feature of a good theory. A good theory should be neutral. Money is neutral in the long run. We knew this in monetary economics. A 4% money growth gives you 4% inflation eventually, and don't worry about what happens. Well, in the long run, interest rates and inflation have to move together. And so if the Fed nails interest rates, inflation eventually has to get, eventually may be a long time. There may be short run stuff on the other end. But this is a good model because it expresses long run neutrality of interest rates. And so that tells you if there's no further shocks, it will eventually go away. That's a theory, and we'll look for empirical confirmation for firstly. So I want to point out right here in the graphs. Okay, let's talk about, that's the end of theory. We have two tools to think about. We have the effects of a fiscal shock, the effects of a monetary shock. And this interesting prediction about even if the Fed does nothing, inflation goes away. The Fed can help. Let's suppose you wake up in this world. What could the Fed do? The Fed could respond, as our Fed is doing. Then you add these two things, it would bring down inflation in the short run and bring it up in the long run. Well, that's a good thing. Smoothing out inflation is a good thing. The Taylor rule is a good thing, even in this world, because it smooths out the inflation by adding these things two together, but gives us that longer inflation in the long run. So let's go look at some. Where are we? Here we are now. Recent inflation. I plotted both the CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index, and the core, which excludes food and energy. That's kind of more, it doesn't wobble around quite so much, as you'll see. And here we have the interest rate. So what happened is exactly January 2021, inflation took off. John, I turned in the first draft of Fiscal Theory of the Price Level, the Princeton University Press, and cause and effect, inflation took off. The Fed did absolutely nothing about this for a full year and is only now slowly starting to bring interest rates up towards inflation, but still nowhere near current inflation. So it's funny to hear the financial press, which believes in adaptive expectations, talking about high interest rates. Right now, we have unprecedented negative interest rates, unless you, of course, think inflation's coming right back again. But why would you think that? Anyway, we'll talk about why you would think that. Here's where we are. Here's where we are, especially relative to recent history. So here's the history since 1990, which is pretty much when the inflation of the 70s and 80s ended. And you can see inflation here, both measured as inflation, we're batting around 2.5%. In the Great Recession, they came down from 2.5% to batting around 2%, just absolutely nothing. Bob Hall, one of my favorite colleagues, counseled me to stop working on inflation because, John, all you need to know about inflation is 2%. Fortunately, I didn't give up, but I got really lucky that it happened so soon. So you can see, however, how very unprecedented this event was, that boom, we got some inflation. So our questions, the questions I want to head for current policy is, why did this happen? And is the Fed being too slow going to make it worse? And what are the dangers for inflation going forward? But we also have to think a little bit about a deeper history to verify our ideas. So what happened here? These are facts. Now I'm going to give you a little more opinion. When you see this kind of thing, and you have spent 20 years of your life on that kind of model, it seems kind of like I'm a 2-year-old with a hammer and somebody just put the world's biggest nail right in front of me. That certainly seems a lot like, well, what happened in January 2021? It was the last nail in the coffin of the most immense fiscal shock that we've seen in generations. Through the COVID event and beyond, our government pretty much literally did drop money from helicopters. The Fed, let's not get too far into the mechanics unless you want to, but the Fed basically printed up $3 trillion of new money, gave it to the Treasury, and the Treasury wrote people checks. The Treasury borrowed another $2 trillion of money and wrote people more checks. So the debt part in debt over price level went up by 30% in the form of writing checks to every registered voter. Well, I shouldn't be so cynical. A lot of this was important. There was a crisis. And I think given that we are in an economy where bailouts are the way we handle every crisis, and everybody's over leveraged to the hilt, it was important. And it's important, people who got unemployed, we didn't want them to be out on the street in the middle of the pandemic. I think it was vastly overdone, but that's not important. Whether necessary, meeting the exigencies of the pandemic, whether ridiculously overdone fiscal stimulus, whatever you think of it, the fact is we dropped $5 trillion from helicopters. Ehud, go ahead and ask a question.
Sorry, go ahead, Ehud.
John, it's great to see you. My sense is that, as I indicated in the email, in the chat, that in terms of prospective inflation, we're looking at about 2.5% for the 5, 10, and 30-year maturities, and they've managed to bring real rates up. So they are sort of impacting things that way. So I agree with you, they waited too long, but aren't they signaling now in a credible fashion?
Well, markets are right now. Yeah, the market expected inflation is low. But first of all, why is the market expected inflation low? Why does the market seem to think that even without the Fed raising interest rates, this will all go away on its own? I don't know. Larry Summers thinks it's going to explode unless interest rates go up to, 9, 10, 11, 12%. Secondly, don't be so, and I mean, I'm Mr. Efficient Markets, so it's hard to argue with that. Markets were completely wrong. So markets, along with the Fed, completely missed this. You look at the yield curve out here, even despite the fact that fiscal stimulus was going nuts, the yield curve was completely flat. Nobody said the break-evens were zero. Inflation was going to be 2% forever. So markets can be wrong, in part because other shocks can come on. And markets have been wrong in the past. The interest, I don't have long-term rates. Long-term rates follow short-term rates here. Long-term bonds never saw the inflation coming in the 70s, and long-term bonds never saw that it was going to go away in the 80s. So you are right. Current market expectations are for this to go away on its own. The Fed's expectation is this to go away on its own. I think the question for us is why in the world, given the conventional wisdom is that, until interest rates are above inflation, it explodes positively. But we haven't gotten a theory. I just want, why did we get this inflation? Why did we get this burst of inflation? Well, this story is completely consistent with, we're about here. So if you want to think, I'm agreeing with you, actually. If this is the graph that we match this experience to, it says you get a burst of inflation, you inflate away a lot of the debt, and then it goes away, exactly as markets are forecasting. And I'm just nervous about this because I really respect John Taylor and Larry Summers, and they think the opposite is true. Okay, so why did we get inflation? Well, fiscal theory says, oh, of course you get inflation, agreeing with Milton Friedman on that. It's not that easy, though. And here's where the storytelling gets a little more difficult. For a fiscal theorist, it's debt versus not this year's deficit. It's debt versus expected repayment over a generation. So it's a little harder question. Why do people not trust the government to repay this debt? Yeah, sure, we dropped, $5 trillion, but we dropped more than that to fight World War II, and we paid it back. So that's a little harder argument to make, and I'll try to tell some stories. Let me highlight, though, the big difference. Why is this analysis different from Larry Summers' analysis? Larry looks at deficits and says, no, Larry was very good. Even though he was Mr. Secular Stagnation Fiscal Stimulus for a decade, he saw this happening and said, here comes the inflation, even though the Fed completely missed it. Well, that's a ISLM view. You look at today's deficit, you multiply by 1.5, that's the stimulus. Fiscal theory is sort of modern intertemporal macro. It's the present value. It's today's debt relative to the surplus. And that's a harder story to tell. So why don't people believe it'll get repaid this time? And why did they believe it'll get repaid last time? Well, let me tell some stories. Again, I don't have proof, I have stories. Certainly was relevant that at least in 2008, I graphed it here, the last increase in debt, there's the stimulus last time around. The government was promising that we'll have deficit today and debt repayment tomorrow. And nobody was saying anything about that in 2020. Even Janet Yellen in her confirmation hearing said, don't worry about the debt. Interest rates are low. They'll be low forever. We don't have to worry about that. Interest rates did become low in the 2000s. We paid back a lot of the debt in the 2010s by very low real interest rates. The chance that real interest rates get really, really low right now seems a little unusual. And let me emphasize heterogeneity. That's something not in the model. But the fact of printing up money and sending it to people as checks is surely more powerful in a lot of ways than borrowing in treasury markets where people are investors and then sending it basically to pay government workers' salaries. Anyway, at least we have a story for why did inflation explode? Now let's think about the harder question, which is, I think, where the questions are going. Is it going to get worse, or will it go away? This little graph does suggest will it go away? And what about the Fed? The Fed has woken up. It's not still asleep. My little simulation is, what if the Fed does nothing? Can the Fed help inflation? And this is the big policy debate right now. Must the Fed raise interest rates well above inflation to bring inflation down? Or was this a one-time shock that will in some sense go away? So I remind you, there's the fiscal shock theory. That's why we had inflation. Here's what the Fed can do about it. The Fed can add higher interest rates with lower inflation a little bit now to give us, here's a simulation of what happens. What happens if there's a fiscal shock, same as this one, but the Fed raises interest rates responding to the inflation. In other words, adds this one together as John Taylor might have advocated. Well, instead of inflation that does this, right, can you guys see the, Carlos, can you guys see the little triangle, the little arrow moving?
Yeah.
Okay, instead of inflation doing this, instead of output doing this, what you get, the Fed gets if it raises interest rates persistently, it lowers the inflation today at the expense of raising inflation in the future. Inflation is no longer always and everywhere just a monetary phenomenon. It is also a fiscal phenomenon. If this fiscal shock happened, the bondholders have got to lose money. The only thing the Fed can do is drag that out and have different class of bondholders lose money. So here's what happens.
John, what's the black lines? I'm sorry, I don't see the label.
The black lines are output.
Okay.
And the red line is inflation and the blue line is interest rate. And so in this simulation, rather than we have the same shock as here, but rather than the Fed just leaving interest rate constant, the Fed says, I will raise interest rates so that interest rates are 0.9 times inflation, a form of a Taylor rule.
Mm-hmm.
So here you can see that interest rates are 0.9 times inflation. The interest rate rises. And what does that do to inflation? That brings inflation down in the short run, brings inflation up in the long run. But that's a very great and good thing, because the Phillips curve depends on inflation relative to expected inflation. And by making inflation sort of a random walk, the output effects are much smaller. Now, maybe you didn't want the output effects to be much smaller. This shows you how the Fed raising interest, there's fiscal stimulus here. The Fed raising interest rates undoes the fiscal stimulus. Well, there was too much fiscal stimulus. So the Fed raising interest rates undoes a lot of fiscal stimulus, removes the output volatility. So it's a good thing to do. But that's the limit of what the Fed can do. The Fed is not all powerful. You can see here, you get the inflation sooner or later. As you can see here, you're going to get the inflation sooner or later. It's just going to come later rather than sooner. So monetary policy is very important. You know, what does fiscal theory say about monetary policy? Very important. It has a lot to say about the dynamics of inflation, but it's not always and everywhere. When there's a fiscal shock, if the government, it's got to get inflated away out of the debt sooner or later, and all the Fed can do is smooth that out.
John, question here. The way you have the Fed doing something now is synchronous with the fiscal shock, and what we saw is that the Fed is a year behind. Did you have? Yeah. Is there any impact of that sort of delay in the simulation here or not?
No. So what I'm trying to do like 5 different questions in one graph. This is why a Taylor rule is a good idea, even in a fiscal theory world. So moving right away would have been better because you would have smoothed the inflation. So you got to mentally take this guy and add that guy with a 1 period delay, and you'll get some sense of what we get now. So you get the initial inflation shock, but now the Fed can smooth out at least, but even though it waited, it can smooth out the rest. So I would guess, still inflation shock, but then we can bring it down soon at the cost of keeping it up for a long time. Can you sort of visually add this?
Yes, I know I can. My question was more like if there was something that would maybe screw up the dynamics a bit, that, extra increase, because you see here they're going down the same period, anyway, so I see what happened if I just delay the right picture by 1 period. And that's basically what you're saying.
These are impulse response functions and linear models, so you're allowed to add them.
Got it.
Sorry, we seem to be having a light issue that I can't seem to do anything about, so sorry. So now this ought to be, you're being very polite. This is a radical graph. The idea that despite the fact that markets believe it, and despite the fact that the Fed believes it, that interest rates, that inflation will go away even if the Fed does nothing. What? That idea keeps me up at night because the equations scream it. I've been playing whack-a-mole with equations that scream this for a decade now. So let's really get a sense of where that's coming from. Can inflation really go away without a period of interest rates much greater than inflation? Do we have to? Let's go back to, the standard story says even this was not enough. It took interest rates going to 20% to bring inflation down. That's the standard story of the 70s and 80s. And that story, that's what, Larry, Jason Furman, even John Taylor are saying right now. Here comes the huge recession, and the sooner we get after it, the better. And inflation will not go away until that happens. Whereas this is saying, no, don't worry about it. Well, worry about it. It'll last a while, but as long as there's no more fiscal blowouts, it will go away on its own. Do we really believe that? Well, how do you decide if you believe anything in economics? You look at the assumptions. So all models, and it comes down to a very simple question. It's about future. It's about where do expectations come from? All models have this Phillips curve in them. Inflation today comes from expected inflation minus the effect of real interest rates. Why? Because if we all know that inflation will be high next year, we raise prices today, we demand higher wages today. So inflation depends always on expected inflation. And then there's the effect, higher real interest rates can bring down inflation relative to expected inflation. So what's the conventional view? The conventional view uses adaptive expectations. Inflation is whatever inflation has been in the recent past, and then affected by interest rates. But look at what that means. If inflation today is past inflation and then the effect of real interest rates, then a high real interest rate lowers inflation I'm getting, I always have troubles getting signs right. That's why I can never do international economics. If inflation, it depends on lagged inflation, then inflation is unstable. The good story version of this is if you drive around looking in the rearview mirror, you're going to veer off the road. And this is where the view comes from, that inflation's inherently unstable. That's Milton Friedman's 1968 address. And what the Fed has to do is move interest rates promptly and more than one for one. It's like a seal balancing the ball on its nose. If the seal does nothing, inflation teeters off and spirals away. Instead, if inflation moves, the Fed has to move interest rate more than one for one to stabilize it. Now, where does the stability view come from? Well, suppose it's expected future inflation. Expected inflation is forward-looking. It's about the future. Well, now, if interest rates are low, inflation's stable. If you're making your expectations of the future by looking through the windshield, the car naturally comes back on the road on its own. Inflation is stable all on its own and does eventually go away. The Fed is sort of look more like Professor Calculus. So that's in theory the two, this view relative to this view. And when I did fiscal theory, I mixed fiscal theory with rational expectations because that's kind of like the simplest model way I like to go. But perhaps we should be looking at adaptive expectations. And perhaps it is true that unless the Fed moves interest rates by more than one for one, inflation will spiral away. Well, which is true. Let's look at, and by the way, these graphs all assume the rational expectations. You can see inflation stable on its own. Here we have history to think about. So fiscal histories is about histories. And the most recent episode to analyze, where we know how it turned out, is 2008 and the zero bound. Now, let's compare these two theories, unstable inflation spirals versus stable inflation pendulum. How do they deal with the zero bound era? The zero bound was an amazing experiment in monetary policy. We don't really know which of these two is happening so long as we live in a history like this. Both Professor Calculus and the seal, inflation and interest rates, move together. We just don't really know, is it stable or unstable? Hard to tell. How could we tell those two theories these two theories apart from the data? Well, the only way to tell is an experiment. SEAL, keep your nose still for a while. Calculus, stop swinging around the pendulum and we'll watch. Does it explode away or does it go away on its own? And we hadn't run that experiment. There's, it's really good reason not to know. But then the government ran the experiment for us. So one of the most dramatic experiments in recent history was just run. Interest rates stuck at zero in the US for nearly 10 years. What happened to inflation? Did it spiral away or was it in the end stable? Look, here's inflation. Boom, 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 boom. Nothing happened to inflation. And not just in the US. Here's Europe, 14 years, interest rates hit zero. All the worthies who are now saying inflation will spiral away said we're going to have deflation spiraling away. Japan, 27 years. 27 years of here comes the great deflation spiral, and it never happened. I mean, it's a very natural prediction. I don't want to make fun of it. It was very reasonable given how people think about inflation at the time. Why? Inflation, in fact, in 2008, we get a little bit of deflation. Real interest rates are negative. What happens? That tightens aggregate demand and makes deflation worse. Real interest rates are more negative. More deflation gets worse. Lots and lots of people were saying, here comes the deflation spiral. We need to do something dramatic to avoid the deflation spiral. They said that of Japan too, and they were right. That's what the adaptive expectations model says will happen, but it didn't happen. So this is really quite a review. This is a Michelson-Morley experiment. I titled the paper that way. In monetary policy, we find out that, hey, it looks like it's stable. Now, every episode has multiple explanations. You can always add epicycles, but that's a powerful episode, at least consistent with the idea of stability. The second thing that happened, why did this deflation spiral not break out? Well, let's look hard at the models that said, here comes the deflation spiral. They had, the old Keynesian models had instability. The new Keynesian models had multiple equilibria, which I'm not really going to talk about, but they both said, we're in danger of 1933. We're in danger of massive deflation. Let's put our fiscal theory hat back on. In order to have, suppose there's a massive deflation, cut the price level 50%. That means government bonds are worth double what they used to be. For government bonds to be worth double what they used to be, let's see, do I have it? I have it here. For government bonds to be worth double what they used to be, the price level goes down by half. Government bonds are worth double, taxes have to double. So do you think it is at all possible that, 2008 turns into 1933, we cut the price level in half, and the response of the US Congress is austerity. We need to triple taxes in order to pay off a windfall, to double the real amount that we give to Wall Street fat cats and the Chinese central bankers and the rich who own our government bonds. I submit that's not a very reasonable idea of what the US Congress is going to do, and what the US Congress did not do. What they're going to do is stimulus. They're going to do is we're going to do everything we can to print money, haul it out the window, and give it to people to avoid this deflation. So fiscal theory, it tells you why we didn't get the deflation spiral in two ways. One, it's stable. Two, in order to have a big deflation, you need to have fiscal austerity, and the government doesn't behave that way. That's a key assumption, off in the footnotes of the other models. So we've now interpreted our second episode. Why was inflation so stable at the long zero bound, and why was there no deflation spiral? It makes sense. Here's now the 1970s, a little more challenging. The 1970s, 1980s is the standard, the conventional view says the Fed reacted too slowly in the 70s, and only finally interest rates were above inflation to drive them back down. It's the unstable view. The seal finally got its nose out and drove the ball back in the other way. But let's look hard at that episode as well. First of all, something I found kind of interesting, the Fed was not as slow. It was 1 for 1 here. In fact, here it's more than 1 for 1. Here's about 1 for 1. Here about 1 for 1 and a little more. The idea that the Fed did nothing is simply incorrect. The Fed was moving. Second thing that happened, inflation declined twice in a row, Well, certainly here in 1975, inflation did go away, even without the Fed having a sustained period. Now, it didn't go all the way away. It didn't keep going down here. But the idea that you must have interest rates perpetually higher than inflation to drive inflation down, simply not true in 1975. And then to make this run, we really have to have so what really happened in 1980? Was this really the episode that proves inflation is always and everywhere just a monetary phenomenon, and you just need a Federal Reserve chair with enough heart to do it? Well, the 1980s and 1970s and 1980s also had fiscal policy. So here is a graph of what happened to fiscal policy in the 1970s and the 1980s. What I've graphed here is the real primary surplus. This is the object that pays back debt in the fiscal theory of the price level. And you can see, and I graphed here the negative, the unemployment rate, so we can get one of the most important determinants of the surplus. So here we go into deficits, then we start paying back debt, deficits, pay back debt, deficits, pay back debt, deficits, pay back debt, okay? So that the general sign of it looks reasonable. You can see fiscal policy is certainly not exogenous. One of the most important things for the size of deficits is the unemployment rate. When people are unemployed, the government sends the money, rightly so. And when the economy is doing badly, tax revenues go down, so we get deficits. But now let's look at the history of the 70s and 80s through this light. First of all, the 70s were not, the inflation of the 70s was not just the Federal Reserve doing dumb things. In the 1970s, we had deficits. And this is kind of widely recognized that what got the whole business going was Johnson's desire to run the Vietnam War and the Great Society and not raise taxes. In fact, 1975 was the biggest surplus, real primary surplus, that anyone had seen since the Second World War. The productivity slowdown and that sort of general bad economy made it much worse. More importantly, 1980, the standard history you hear is, the horrible Reagan deficits. Well, the Reagan deficits were mostly high interest rate on the outstanding debt. The actual primary surpluses weren't that bad at all, especially when you look at how horrible unemployment was at the time. But most importantly, inflation ended right about here. What happened to the present value of surpluses? The present value of surpluses boomed. So what happened here? Well, the 1980s were not just monetary stringency. In 1980, in 1982 and 1986, there were important tax reforms that together lowered the federal marginal tax rate, the top federal marginal tax rate, from 70% to 28%. Now, Liz Truss is in danger because she proposed lowering it from 45 to 40. 70 to 28. Let's talk about some incentives here, along with declines in the corporate tax, broadening the base, a kind of tax reform, bipartisan tax reform we dream about. There was a deregulatory reform, and the economy started growing like crazy. And in fact, at least with the ex post wisdom, bonds over price level is present value of surpluses. The present value of surpluses skyrocket. And if you only saw that the growth was going to do this, it makes perfect sense. In fact, this is the trouble of economists who write papers about current events. By the late 1990s, economists were writing papers about what are we going to do when the government pays off all the government debt and there's no more government debt around. And the danger is that it takes 3 to 5 years to publish a paper. So you're trying to publish it out here when all the party was over. 1980 was a joint fiscal, monetary, and microeconomic reform. And if you look through history more generally, all the successful stabilizations have been joint fiscal, monetary, and microeconomic reforms. The ends of the hyperinflations in the 1920s happened with no unemployment, no monetary stringency, just instantly inflation went away. Why? Because they fixed the fiscal problem and also the microeconomic problem. The inflation targeting regimes of the early 1990s, they put in an inflation target, a monetary target, but at the same time, they fixed their microeconomics and started growing again. Contrary-wise, many Latin American countries, they do the monetary thing. They will quite often raise interest rates, bring down inflation for a while, as we did in the 70s, and then it all goes to heck again. Why? Well, because you can buy a little time with monetary policy. Where did it go? You can buy a little time with monetary policy, but unless you fix the fiscal policy, inflation's coming back. And that's exactly what typically happens in Latin America with just monetary reforms, and what did not happen in the 1980s. So there's this grander picture. Stopping inflation needs fiscal, monetary, and microeconomic reform. You can't just raise tax rates, because you need decades of surplus that only comes from economic growth. You'll just climb up a sand dune if you try to raise tax rates. Which brings me to my worry. So where are we going?
Let me ask a question here, John.
Yes.
You made fun of Rio. You made fun of Rio.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, question, and then I'll give you my last point, and we can have.
Sorry. No, it's just a question about Latin America mentioning the successful stabilizations in the late 80s and early 90s all came with very strong fiscal policy as well. There was monetary attempts that all failed, and until serious fiscal surpluses, primary surpluses were generated, no country got out of the hyperinflation mechanism, right? You sound like you know Latin American history better than I do. And by the way, there's a wonderful Latin American history book that's out from the University of Minnesota with, Sargent, Nicolini, and Tinquijo. But that's my impression of Latin American history. Many, many attempts to do just some monetary trick, but not fix the fiscal problem. Inflation comes back worse. And sometimes, in fact, you need fiscal support for monetary policy. So what's happened in Brazil a few times is raise interest rates to try to solve the inflation problem. Raising interest rates raises the interest costs on the debt and makes the fiscal problem worse. And guess what? Inflation explodes. So, one thing that's certainly true in the equations of the model is that if you can't pay the extra interest costs on the debt, then raising interest rates raises inflation. You don't even get this lowering inflation effect. And that is what I am worried will happen to us. So my little graphs here, my comforting little graph here, where's my comforting little graph? It all goes away. This is an impulse response function. A shock at time zero, no more shocks. But what if you keep throwing fuel on the fire? We have now crossed the Rubicon in fiscal theory where people thought the last $5 trillion of debt cannot be repaid, so they're inflating it away. What if we do this again? What if there's an additional fiscal shock? So here's our fiscal situation. This graph came before the government. The US government added $1 trillion of student debt forgiveness to narrowly targeted to Democratic voters. Good job there. Before Liz Truss decided to spend a lot of money subsidizing everybody's energy bills, Europe seems to be doing the same. So certainly the idea in Washington that how we solve every problem is by borrowing or printing money and handing it out is not over. And if we get more fiscal shocks, then we really are in trouble. These are just the Congressional Budget Office projections. This doesn't look too good. This is debt to GDP ratio. And it's worse than this, because let me remind you, back here, they thought it would grow slowly. They didn't think that anything bad would happen. But of course, anytime something bad happens, boom, we issue a lot more debt. Pandemic, boom, we issue a lot more debt. And I think we're already seeing the next shock. People think, oh, these are just once in a century shocks. Don't worry about it, the Lucas Stokey state contingent default. But once in a century shocks seem to happen every 10 years and now every 5 years. So we are having the energy shock that nobody expected. If or when Xi Jinping invades Taiwan, we're going to have a financial and economic shock like nobody's business. And what is our government going to do about it? Bail out the entire financial system again, try to borrow or print $5 trillion. And are we really going to hold it, or is that just going to cause inflation fast? So, the only answer is the joint monetary, fiscal, and microeconomic reform if you want to durably get rid of inflation. Okay, I'll stop there and take more questions. Or if you can't manage to play Jeopardy and put a question mark on it, you can give a speech too if you want. I'm going to leave the slides up though because sorry, I was muted here.
Fact.
Yes, raise your hand in the Q&A if you have another question, and I'll start here. just by asking about, you focus a lot on the US, the experience of the fiscal stimulus in the US in the past, well, since 2020, but it seems unusual to me that inflation seemed to have picked up simultaneously across many countries, many developed countries around early 2021. Do you have a story for that at all? I mean, the timing of it, I guess, is just maybe close enough that then maybe they're coming out of the pandemic around the same time. Is that more or less what you're thinking?
So I wish I had cross-country gas for you. My impression is that it happened larger and sooner in the US because our fiscal stimulus was larger than most other countries. But most other countries also did something of the same thing, just to smaller effects. So it hit Europe later. Europe, of course, is now hitting a bigger energy price shock. Now, watch out about the supply side stuff. Supply shocks are shocks to relative prices, not shocks to the price level, but it leads governments to fiscal stimulus. So I think it's, why doesn't this, wait, this is an important question. If energy prices go up, that's not inflation. Inflation is everything going up. So why, if energy prices go up, that means energy prices have to go up relative to wages in a supply shock, but it could be that the wages go down. Why does everything go up? Well, I think when you see that energy price shock, it's perfectly clear what the governments are going to do about it, which involves a fiscal mess. And so you can sort of see the fiscal mess coming the minute you see the energy price shock. So they're following us. And there's an extent to which inflation is imported around the world. So once you see the US inflating, other countries are kind of it gets imported to other countries because fighting it all alone is hard. But not every country's had inflation. I gather Brazil and Mexico are actually doing relatively well compared to the US, but I don't have all the numbers there.
Well, so I can tell you about Brazil at least, which I follow more closely than I should just forget about it. But and Brazil has actually had, even though they did have a helicopter moment in COVID of sending more checks, the primary surplus is actually the government accounts have been more sustainable than they have been in a long time under this administration. So it's not surprisingly that didn't expire as much out of control as it did, for example, in Argentina, where things are, particularly messy on the fiscal side, right?
But let me emphasize the great difficulty of fiscal theory, the price level thinking, is that today's deficit doesn't matter. Today's austerity doesn't matter. What matters is the expected present value of primary surplus. Is the kind of thing that pays back debts over decades. And that's why, the criticism of Liz Truss even, $2 billion worth of tax cuts for the rich is causing a bond market. That's ridiculous. Because what matters is your capacity to pay things back over decades. That's exactly. I
think that's exactly what the Brazil incident was. Is that even though they had a momentary, fiscal blowout during COVID, the reforms in place in the Bolsonaro administration are reforms that are long-term ability to pay out debt. So they're talking about basically didn't hire. I mean, there was no increase in the public payroll on the last 4 years in Brazil. There was a huge decrease in the state apparatus, and so basically showing that, hey, we're looking at this in the long run. So
yes.
Yeah, so
this is crucial. So short-run little austerity problems that don't solve the long run. This is what fiscal theory forces you to think about the long run, as opposed to sort of ISLME stuff where this year's this year and next year's next year, and don't worry about it. But so, for example, for the U.S., the U.S. problem is real simple: Social Security and Medicare, and solve the long-run fiscal problem in the U.S. So it's not about raising taxes; it's about reform. I like that word, about giving people the confidence that over decades, come what may, you will be able to pay this back.
All right, there's a question here in the chat. Let's see. John McLean, do you want to ask your question as opposed to me reading out loud?
Yes, please, John.
Let me make you. How do I do this? Sorry. John, you should be able to talk.
Hello, John. Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes.
I wasn't prepared to speak. I was just going to chime in via chat, but I'm happy to ask the question verbally. I've started to read from a number of people, including The Economist magazine and others, that this idea that seems to be growing in acceptance that bringing inflation down to 2% from where we are today is going to be very painful. But if we could just learn to live with 4% inflation, it might be much more easily accommodated, at least in terms of the tightness of Fed and possibly fiscal policy. Presumably, 4% inflation eats away at the fiscal imbalances that you talk about twice as fast as 2% inflation. But do you have any view between the trade-offs of targeting 2% from here versus targeting 4% and just learning to live with the 4% inflation rate?
Yeah, let's do that one, then we'll go on to the next one, one at a time. So this is a view that has nothing to do with fiscal policy, fiscal theory of the price level, or whatever. This is a revival of good old 1970s and it's a view entirely taken within this ISLM adaptive expectations view of where inflation comes from, and the standard view of the 1970s. Let me bring the 1970s, 1980s. And what's amazing to me, Larry Ball even wrote a Brookings paper all about this, but I was around in 1979 when Paul Samuelson and all the same Keynesian worthies were saying the exact same thing. And the view comes down to this idea that, well, I've got it right here. Inflation equals, I should have had inflation equals expected inflation plus unemployment. I probably ruined everything here. The Phillips curve is inflation equals expected inflation plus unemployment. If you think expected inflation is a very slow, people are slow to catch on, then you think it takes years and years of unemployment to bring the inflation down, because it's the adaptive expectations view. Now, what's interesting to me is this was loudly announced in the 1980s. Give up on fighting inflation, Volcker, because it's going to take a decade of high unemployment to bring inflation down. So we might as well just learn to live with it. The exact argument was made in the 1980s, and boom. Now, it was painful. It came down, but it came down faster than anybody's adaptive expectation model ever believed. It was it was miraculous that, look at the graph start right where my arrow is. Don't you think, here we go again? But once the expected inflation fell, boom, inflation was just dead for a generation. So it seems to me like we're just repeating the same old Keynesian story that it takes forever to change expectations, and therefore it's just not worth having the unemployment pain of slowly wringing the inflation expectations out of the economy. To which the fiscal theory adds, and by the way, where does expected inflation come from? What is anchoring? Does anchoring just come from speeches about how inflation is anchored, or else? Well, anchoring comes from a deep faith that the government can pay off its debts and won't inflate them away. So a lot of if you're thinking Phillips curvy and you're thinking in this way, inflation is expected inflation minus here unemployment, then the best way to get expected inflation down is solve the fiscal problem. And that's exactly what Sargent's ends of inflation was brilliant on showing. That's how hyperinflations, 10,000% a day, I don't know what the number was, got fixed by you solve the fiscal problem. That solves the inflation problem, expected inflation problem. The Phillips curve shifts down automatically, and you can end inflation with no unemployment whatsoever if you're just willing to do the fiscal and microeconomic reform right now. So this whole argument strikes me as just a reprise of the 1970s. And I just, go read your Sargent, guys. And I don't know what else to say about it.
Cesare.
So if you look at the moment from 2010 to 2020, we had very low rates at zero, and debt to GDP went from 50% to 100%. So why we didn't have inflation then?
Yeah, good question. Now, let's see. We got our basic equation.
Is it because we expected the government to repay back?
Well, evidently. Now, why?
But then you have a theory that can basically always be true depending on how you.
Well, right. So let's at least see if there's a plausible answer, and worry about testable tomorrow. Because why did debt go up? Debt went up. Where's this? Now, there's two effects here that are very important. One is the surpluses themselves, but in any expected present value, the discount rate matters tremendously. And as I look over post-war US time series, in fact, that discount rate effect is incredibly strong. I mean, the short answer to your question is because interest costs on the debt were really low. Let's see, do we have a graph? Here's a graph. Yeah, here's the period. Notice the interest rate here. We have a negative to, we go from positive real interest rates here to negative real interest rates for a decade, and people thought it was going to keep going. The real interest rates have been negative in where's Europe? Did I lose Europe? And here's Europe and Japan. Negative real interest rates. Now, if real interest rates are negative, you can afford an amazing amount of debt. And I think it was also, it's pretty clear from here that the period of negative interest rates was a surprise. So what happened? Yeah, we ran up a lot of debt, but we got extraordinarily lucky. I mean, this is another way of saying people were happy to hold that debt despite getting very negative real returns. So we, in some sense, paid off a lot of this debt by negative interest rates. Why were people so happy to hold government debt? That's a hard question, but I do think there's a reasonable answer. And so again, fiscal theory does not tell you that there's an instant, easy relationship between debt and the price level, because we see historically, World War II, debt went up to 150% of GDP, a little bit of inflation, but not immense amounts of inflation. Well, people trusted. In that case, it was the surpluses. In the 2010s, very low interest rates on government debt, very famous people, Olivier Blanchard, Janet Yellen, saying, don't worry about that. Interest rates are low. Well, on the economics, they're right. As long as interest rates are really, really low, you can have a lot of debt without having inflation. The danger of that is that when interest rates stop being really low, the adjustable rate on the mortgage goes up and you lose the house. And that's where we may be now. But as long as interest rates are low, it makes sense. And finally, I do think I have some faith in my country. These projections are not conditional expectations. These projections are what happens under current law. And you read the CBO reports, and they are, for government reports, they are as pounding fists on the table as you can imagine, because they say, you got to do something about this. And I think the conditional expectation is that, our country will once again do the right thing after we've tried everything else. We don't have to have a debt crisis. Simple changes to Social Security and Medicare would solve this. A 1986 tax reform was at least possible once, could be done again. So there's nothing economically stopping the U.S. from returning to strong growth and fiscal surpluses. And I think bond markets for a long time thought, they'll get around to it after they're done trying everything else. Now, I think bond markets, first of all, we do not have the scope for lowering real interest rates another 3 percentage points. Where did my real interest rates graph go? This cannot repeat itself. We can't go to -6 real interest rates for a decade. And I think there's some definite worry about, are these people really good for it?
Hatfield.
Yeah, this might be the forward-looking version of Cesare's question. So your theory is the key element, the expected value of future surpluses. Is there any way any economic?
Wait, I can't.
Sorry, your sound went away. Go back. Sorry, John.
No problem.
I'm trying to
So
fix
your
my
theory
light here.
starts off by saying we really care about the expected value of future surpluses, and that's what's going to determine inflation and all the rest of it. Is there any way we can measure, using some other financial instrument, the expected value of future surpluses, so we can see if it all hangs together? If
that would be lovely, wouldn't it? And let me, it's not that easy. And let me just appeal again to the theory of finance. So in 1968, our forebears announced that price is the present value of dividends. What's the natural thing to do with that? Well, let's go take some forecast of dividends, some model of the discount factor, discount them back, and test whether asset prices are equal to present value of dividends. If you know anything about modern finance, you know what a disaster that was. Never worked, was never useful. Now, does that mean prices present value of dividends is a useless theory? No, we use it in lots and lots of ways. But the ways we use it are much more sophisticated and more useful than trying to outguess the markets on what dividends are and discount them back. Now, it's a useful exercise to make that calculation, see if it works or doesn't, what kind of discount rates you need to make it work. There's a theorem that says there always is one. But unfortunately, now that also is this should be we got 50 years of beautiful empirical work in finance that doesn't try to do that. And we can do the same kinds of things for fiscal theory as we do there. And some of my work does that, exploit for example, you can treat it as an identity. We know it has to work. But what moved? Was it expectations of surpluses or was it discount rates, given that it had to be one of the two? That's a question I can answer. And it turns out it is the discount rates that are moving.
A question here in the chat that it doesn't have a microphone, so I'll ask. How does fixing the problem affect the average U.S. citizen seeing it deal with modifying Social Security?
Wait, is that in the chat? If I can read it, maybe I'll be...
Yes.
Oh, how does
it affect the citizenship, the citizens?
Social Security is a little bit less of a problem. So I know Social Security can be made solvent by just changing the inflation indexation a little bit, so we don't have to cut grandma from the train. Our medical system is, as you know, an insane bloated disaster and can be made. There's two ways to make it affordable. One is to let the free market reign, which would make it cheap and efficient. The other is to go to pure socialism, which would make it cheap. But we're kind of stuck on the intermediate case between all of those things. Or we could simply decide to do what Europe does. And if we're going to have 50% of GDP expenditures, then we're going to have middle class 50% of GDP taxes. And so we can at least have a faintly solvent government if we abandon growth for a generation, the way Europe has. So those are the three options. I like the free market option, but
so let me ask you a question about that, follow up on that. It seems that you said a few times, fix the fiscal the fiscal problem, do microeconomic reforms, which to me, I interpret that as doing something about raising growth prospects also, right, as a result. And it seems that what Liz Truss, again, which came up a couple of times today, was basically trying to focus on the deregulatory reform and some sort of like reform that would potentially increase growth, like a tax reform, for example, that would be potentially growth increasing in the future, but not dealing with the fiscal mess at first. And if you read the reactions, things are whatever. It's hard to read exactly what we can take out of that. But the point is that is there any lesson on the sort of like convex combination between the two, growth inducing policies versus, should we focus on growth or should we focus on fiscal austerity?
Yeah, Liz Truss seems to be right on all the policy and incredibly wrong on all the messaging. But remember how long it took. Reagan and Thatcher were savaged by the same intelligentsia and media for 2 to 3 years, and went through really difficult economics times when they put it in. Look, inflation is a wake-up call. The idea that all of our problems just need more stimulus is over. We found the supply constraint of the U.S. economy. Here it is. Turns out we were walking right next to the edge of the cliff all along. And that just, everything that sort of standard policy said for the last 20 years. No, I always thought they were wrong. I thought we were right at supply anyway. Turns out, boom, we just hit that brick wall of supply. And, increasing the supply side of the economy is really the only way out. I rebel at the idea that requires short-run pain. Deregulation let's not call it deregulation, let's call it sane regulation, reformed tax codes can increase output and even government revenues, even in the short run, not the long run. So it's not even obvious to me. I mean, Liz Truss, bless her heart, she wrote a libertarian book, and then the first thing she did in office was pass $60 billion of subsidy to pay everybody's energy bills. Not even, as the Germans did, preserving the marginal incentive to conserve on energy while bailing you out of the. I mean, that's not a great way to start a libertarian manifesto. So I don't even think it takes austerity. High marginal tax rates that hurts economies in the short run. So I think that the growth-oriented policy is what you end up doing after you've done anything else. It does not hurt the overall economy. What it does hurt is all sorts of entrenched interests. The taxi companies hate Uber. The day Uber comes in, you and I get better, cheaper taxi rides, and low-income people and recent immigrants get better ways to work, and everything's better instantly. There's no period of difficult taxi economics the day Uber comes in, and the same is true of the economy generally.
Francisco, go ahead.
Hi. I think you talked about some of the impacts of Social Security and Medicare, but I wanted to ask your view about the whole demographic shift that we're going to go, in the next decade or two, about, the age structure of, developed countries becoming more old, obviously, and how that consumption and production, or how that impacts overall consumption, production, and the outlook, in this case for inflation, but also impacting the growth of GDP ultimately, and how that can be one of those, if not shock, but a complication in stabilizing inflation.
Yeah, the people worry a lot about that, and there was a lot about how lower interest rates were the savings glut, and we're all getting older and so forth. As I look at it now, we're kind of veering off at the micro and so forth. As I look at the problems of the U.S. economy, I don't see just too many retired people as the issue, as much as, boy, we'd love to do stuff, but we can't get the permits. I just rehabbed a house in Palo Alto. Let me tell you about what it takes to get the permits around here. Just simply the age structure seems, you put your priorities on where you think we're holding back the U.S. economy, and the thicket of distorting taxes and regulations seems to be much more of something holding us back than the age structure. Now, as we get older, we also are, it's just an amazing thing. We're all living healthier. So getting older is a problem if you have, rules that everyone retires on a full pension at 60 or 65. Well, you know what? Maybe we should change that. Public workers, military, and so forth. We no longer work coal mines where, your back is broken at age 60. If we're going to have people living better than just older, people living to, 70, 80, 90, and our health and cognitive abilities get better because of medicine, well, people should be working till 70, 80, and 90, and that would solve a lot. So there's some big disincentives. When Social Security was put in, people retired at 65 and they were dead at 72. It was not a system designed for retire at 65 and then live 30 years at taxpayer expense. So I don't see why demographics has to be such a huge problem if you, and we have to, so there's only room for so many people on the planet. And so we have to transition to a lower population growth sooner or later. And it's wonderful if that population growth includes lots of old people who are healthy and able to work. So, number one, I just relative to the other inefficiencies I see out there, just sort of numbers of people on ends of things doesn't strike me as the most important one. And number two, I see a lot of the difficulties in transitioning to an older economy as imposed by kind of rules and customs that can and will change sooner or later.
Thank you.
Let me, John McHale, go ahead.
Hey, sorry, I'm back again. John, I understand the mechanism whereby inflation can correct the future fiscal deficits, the imbalances. And I understand the mechanism whereby inflation expectations influence the actual inflation, which helps correct those imbalances. But what is the mechanism where perceptions of the future fiscal imbalances then cause the higher inflation expectations? Are there shop owners out there that are concluding we're not going to be able to pay back all this debt as a country, so I have to increase my prices? And how does that even work if they're operating in a competitive market? They would need all their competitors to also perceive that we're never going to be able to pay back this debt. We have to perceive inflation as going higher and increase our prices accordingly. Is there a mechanism out there that we can ever observe, or do we have to kind of accept in similar ways to asset pricing? I've read your book on asset pricing, that it's as if these things are occurring in the economy, even though it's really hard to identify who's actually conducting themselves that way.
Well, yeah, the psychology of it is interesting. What does a marginal product feel like? I think Carlos, I should turn to our Latin American colleagues like Carlos. You know, how does the average Argentine shop owner understand that because the long run fiscal problem is there, inflation is going to keep getting worse, and so they run to U.S. dollars. I do think, in part now, the nebulousness of it is a advantage as well as a disadvantage. In the short run, what a government debt holder wants to know about is the government going to roll over the debt? If I'm holding one year U.S. government bonds, I'm not thinking about deficits 30 years from now. I'm thinking about, will the U.S. government be able to sell new 1 year bonds to roll over and pay me? And so I think, the psychology of people holding government debt in the short run is appropriately a short run psychology. And that, there's really kind of a run mechanics to it. Since our debt is primarily short term, the fundamental shock may be some worry about surpluses, but there's a sort of a self-confirming psychology to it. This is just classic short-term debt. When you're financing with short-term debt, you're open to runs. And I think that helps us to explain, why is inflation so hard to forecast? Why did 1,500 PhD economists on the staff of the Federal Reserve completely blow it and didn't see 8 or 9% inflation coming? So like stock prices, our inability to forecast inflation is, I think, something that theory needs to explain. And like stock prices, this is a theory that is quite consistent with just how hard it is to forecast inflation. So yeah, I'll leave it. I'll leave it at that. All of the difficulties of as if rational expectations, macroeconomics, and finance are here, but it seems to connected to psychology. I think you can sometimes, and I think it's in a general trust of the government. I would also say there's a whole extra section of fiscal theory on this. Well-run governments they don't just leave it to nebulous expectations. They have institutions designed to ensure you don't really need to know what's the primary surplus going to be 27 and a half years from now if they put in some Medicare reform. That's a crazy way to try to think of running an economy. What you want is some sort of general understanding by people. Oh yeah, they'll figure it out. They're good for it sooner or later. They won't default or inflate it away. That's enough. And so healthy institutions rather than precise expectations is what gives people the faith to hold government debt and not try to spend it. That's what the gold standard was. The gold. I don't think we should run a gold standard, but recognize for what it was. It was a commitment. We're going to get the taxes needed to get the gold if we need it to pay off this debt at its gold value. So that's a way of telling people, we're going to support whatever surpluses it takes to pay back the debt at this price. That's what inflation targets do. When a government agrees with its central bank to an inflation target, the government is also saying, yeah, and we, on the other hand, we won't tell you exactly what it's going to do, but don't worry, we're good for it. So I think institutions that tell people we're good for it one way or the other are really what quiets the expectations on the right-hand side, rather than explicit fiscal promises that you expect the guy running a gas station in Fresno to keep track of.
All right, let me close with one more question, John. Can you go back to the slide where you have the professor calculus in the seal?
Oh yeah, one of my favorites.
I'm trying to see if I understand this relative to what Larry Summers would say right now. So Larry Summers is on the left-hand side camp here, in the seal camp, right?
Yes.
Is that right? Yes. Okay. So so he's looking at this and saying, okay, we need to raise interest rates quite a bit to 10% before inflation can start to come down. That's his view. Meanwhile, your model is saying that, well, if there's no new shock, this might go down by itself.
Yeah,
right?
if there was a one-time $5 trillion
Right.
bucks, we
Right.
inflate away the $5 trillion bucks, you're done. It's a price
Correct.
shock, not an inflation.
So here's my question or / concern is that if this is not just one shock, if you're right, your model's right, and we have this sort of blowing up of basically our inability to pay future debt is getting to be lower and lower and lower. That's gonna make inflation can persist at a high level. while and which we're going to give fuel to the sort of view that Larry Summers has, like, well, we need to be raising interest rates quite a bit. See my point here of like the spiral of a bad crisis?
Yeah.
Where the folks that are going to, the seal is going to start moving like crazy and nothing's going to happen and just going to hurt a bunch of people as a result of, of the type of financial crisis that might be generated by interest rates going to 12%, 15%, for example. I don't know. What's Larry take on that when you talk to him about it?
I don't, we correspond. We're not that much buds, but you're exactly right. Multiple fiscal shocks. Then you get this over and over again, and that's that's really dangerous. The Fed can try this over and over again, but all alone, there's just limits to what the Fed can do here. It's just fighting a fundamentally unsound fiscal policy with monetary policy. The point of this is to create some recession. So all you get is all the recession, you get stagflation. You get all the recession and none of the inflation reduction. So, and this also goes back to the, what about the 2010s? I think it's reasonable to think, in the 2010s, fiscal policy, there was a lot of debt, but there wasn't any particularly bad news. Nothing happened. Everyone, it was just a sleepy economy for a while. There wasn't a shock. There wasn't, additional bad news about anything throughout here. You need additional bad news to set this off. But we could well get some additional bad news, and that's what keeps me up at night.
All right.
And then the Fed won't be able to do much about it. Then you're Argentina, the Argentine central bank, bless their hearts, they can try all they want, but in the end, if you're going to default on your bonds, you're going to default on your bonds.
Indeed. On that happy note, thank you, John. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And hopefully that next time you're actually here, present. So
yes, me too.
Anyway, I'll see you in Stanford in a little bit. I guess in November we'll be there.
Oh, great. Thanks. I look forward.